Greetings, I'm Dak Rulo, journalist at overwritten.org. I am so excited today to be joined once again by former Senator Mike Gravel of Alaska. He is here today to discuss his book, The Failure of Representative Government and the Solution. This is a book that Mr. Gravel published just a few months ago, I believe, and I read it recently, and we're here to talk to him about it and ask him some questions. So, Mike Gravel, I wanted to begin with a description that you put towards in the introduction of the book. You talked about our civic adolescence. That was the term that you used to describe the American people's lack of engagement with the legislative process. I was wondering if you could begin by talking a little bit about that. What do you mean by civic adolescence?
Well, when you're an adolescent, you're essentially want to have everything, but don't want to take responsibility for it. I want this, but forget that I have to work for it. Parents can pay out. If you got wealthy parents, you're spoiled to death. So that's a form of adolescence. A form of civic maturity is where a citizen takes responsibility for what is enacted into law. Under the present system, enacted into law by representatives who have monopoly on lawmaking, and so they really can't take responsibility because they didn't do it. It was done by representatives. So essentially, they sit back in civic adolescence and I want this, I want that, but I don't want to pay any taxes for that. I want this, but I don't want to take responsibility for what's going wrong about that. That's George's problem, the guy we elected to office. So that's a kind of civic adolescence. We see that in childhood. As you come into your teens and you go through various stages, that you don't bother taking responsibility because you don't have to take responsibility. Now, if you had a form of government where people could participate and make laws, then when they make a bad law, they have to take responsibility and change it. But that's not what happens today. What happens today is politicians do not own up or take responsibility for the mistakes, because if they did, it would hurt them getting reelected. And so the people can't do it because they don't have any civic maturity in this regard. So when you ask me about civic adolescence, that's the representative government is designed to keep citizens in civic adolescence, period.
So it's like a form of political arrested development, in a sense. You might even call it civic infancy, in a way. The way that we are kept alienated or estranged from the legislative process. And I think we see that quite a bit in our unwillingness to form third or even fourth political parties. We want to believe in the powerful institutions because we look on them as kind of like a benevolent paternal or maternal figure. Not to get too Freudian about it, but is that part of what? Oh, go ahead.
What happens is that the parties, we've got a two-party system. And the parties are all about power. It's not results, it's having power. And so they're not inclined to make room for a third party. One may dissolve, and in its the carcass, maybe a new party, the Whigs going to Republican. But keep in mind, if we had a third party, it would act no differently than the existing parties, the two parties. You see this in parliamentary systems. There's really not that much difference in the maturity that's required in a parliamentary system or in what we have is a constitutional system. Both are representative governments, and both do not permit the full participation in the exercise of lawmaking power or legislative power. We are a civilization of law. It took us a long time to get to this point, but we are a citizen. Law is the central part of civilization, the central part of governing, the central part of government. And of course, the people do not have the ability to make law, and that's the shortcoming and the failure of representative government.
Right, and you said that the way that the government treats its citizens as adolescents or children, as subordinates or inferiors. I think you said at one point that the government even sees people as the enemy in a way. It's like the government has to keep the people in that state of arrested development because they fear what would happen if the people were to rise up.
Correct. And of course, the longer that goes on, it goes from a modest pushing the people aside into a more virulent form of oppression, and that will eventually beget violence. And so, if we don't, in this 21st century, if we don't find a device to bring the people into the operation of government as lawmakers, there's no other way to bring them into the government. You got to first understand that. You can't bring them into the executive. You can't bring them into the judiciary. There's only one place you can bring them into, and that's the legislative role. And it could be, you could bring in millions of people as long as you have a proper device for the people to process their new role as lawmakers. And that device is what I've put together in a legislature of the people, or a citizens initiative, national initiative. Without that, if we just gave the people make laws without the procedures to do it in a deliberative fashion, it would be anarchy and would lead to more violence.
Yes, and that is a good segue into the legislative proposals that you've provided here in the book. What you did here was you begin with a description of some of the dysfunction of the current representative system, and then you propose a new radical piece of legislation that you call the Citizens Amendment and the Legislative Procedures Act. So for those who have not yet read the book, and you should definitely read the book, it's published by Author House, and it comes in at just under 80 pages, so you can get it done. You can read this in just a couple of days. Can you provide the audience with a summary of what these two pieces of legislation are?
Okay, if you're going to, essentially what we're doing, we're completing the work of the framers of the Constitution, who purposely left the people procedures out so that people could amend the Constitution or enact laws. And of course, all of the framers basically said the people had the right to change their government. However, if you don't have procedures in how to do that, you're really stuck with the people having no procedures. And as they become more frustrated, it could lead to violence. So to be able to make the changes that we think are important is, first, you have to have a constitutional amendment. Once we have a constitutional amendment that the people can vote on, then you have to accompany that with the legislative procedures that they would implement to act as lawmakers. And then you also would need an agency, like every legislative body has an agency that does the housekeeping, the printing, serves the interest of the legislators. We need a similar agency to serve the interest of the citizens that are voting and proposing legislative procedures. Now, let's take a moment. We can go through the Legislative Procedures Act, but let's take a moment and go through what the constitutional amendment does. The first thing it does is assert. It's got seven sections. The seventh one is the boilerplate, but the first one is it asserts the sovereignty of the people to act as legislators. And this is an innate sovereignty that the people have. Now, people are sovereign not because a constitution is written or anything. People are sovereign only because they are alive. They receive their sovereignty at birth, and they're guided into adulthood by parents or surrogates until they are sovereign adults. And so the first section of the Constitution is to establish the people themselves, saying we are sovereign. and we're going to be making laws. The second item, which is extremely important, is that the second item of the constitutional amendment sanctions the election that takes place that permits the people to vote for the constitutional amendment. If you don't have the ability to create an amendment, then you're nowhere. And so what we do is we set up an electoral process and define it. And then the people vote that because I'm voting on the constitutional amendment to establish my sovereignty, I'm also voting on the procedures, the electoral procedures that permitted me to vote on the constitutional amendment. That's the second part. The third most important is the creation of a citizens' trust, a body that all legislative bodies have to do the housekeeping, a body that permits the people to be able to use the procedures to enact laws or repeal laws in a deliberative fashion. So that's the third one. The fourth one sets up the standards that you need to be able to amend constitutions and to enact laws. The first paragraph part of that standard is that for an amendment to a constitution or charter, it has to be voted on twice in two separate elections 6 months apart. And the reason for that is that it's a constitutional amendment is very serious. And so the people should have to have an opportunity to reflect on what they've done in the first election to be able to correct it in the second election. And then the next issue is very straightforward, is how are you going to pay for all of this? Well, we appropriate the monies from the Treasury in a constitutional amendment. And with that appropriation, we say that the amount of money that was appropriated annually to the Congress, the same amount of money should be appropriated to the Citizens Trust so that the trust can operate the legislature of the people with all these procedures. The next section is something that I think is very important, and that is that anybody that has anything to do with the legislature of the people, opposing or proposing legislation, that anybody who is involved has to be a natural person. That means any kind of a corporation that's involved with this could be committing a felony and would be subject to a year in jail and a $100,000 fine for each infraction. And so we keep this close at hand in the hands of citizens and not corporations, whether they be liberal corporations or conservative corporations. And then the last is just boilerplate, that the people can change this at will. So that's the constitutional amendment. Mm-hmm. Now, what we need is the tools to deliberate this in an intelligent fashion. And so I've set up a law, the Citizens Trust, and this trust made up of trustees who handle the policy aspects of this and are elected and have no chance of being reelected, and the procedures so that we can define how a proposal becomes law. The key elements of the Legislative Procedures Act are the first one that requires that once it's drafted, and you can draft it by the staff members of the trust, for the citizens who want to introduce legislation, that piece of proposed legislation must be put in a poll, and requires that for it to be continue to be processed, 40% of the people in the constituency relative to that legislation must agree that they want to be able to deliberate it and vote upon it, either for or against. And so that now sets it up that all these people that got all this crazy legislation Well, they first and foremost got to get the agreement that 40% of the people in question want to be able to consider it. Now, that's a limitation that's very serious. There's another limitation that's also very serious, and that is that the election on proposed legislation will require a week long, 7/24s, so that the people will have a week to vote on federal legislation, state legislation, local legislation. Now, what does that mean? That means that you can only enact into law or oppose the enactment into law of 52 federal proposals.
Yes.
So that limits it so that the best you can do is enact 52 federal laws in 1 year's time. Now, if you look at chapter, I believe it was chapter 5, where I list the possible amendments to the Constitution and other legislative procedures, legislative acts, you'll see that it's very difficult to get the 52 federal constitutional amendments that are meaningful. And I don't even come close to that in the book. And of course, 52 statutes. Now, a federal constitution requires two votes. So that's 2 weeks if it's approved in the first vote. And then, of course, you've got the rest of the bills that you're interested in. So you can begin to see that what will happen with this procedure is that the people will sort of settle down after the initial flurry and will really devote their attention to setting national policy. And that would, and then you got a win-win, because what you've done is you've forced a maturity on the representatives because the people are now watching up close. That what will happen is that they will do a better job in the day-to-day implementation of the policies that the people set directly. So that's in broad lines the 2 chapters or what's involved with the Legislative Procedures Act and with the Constitutional Amendment. They have to pass together. People have to vote for them together, because if you just had the amendment without the legislative procedures, you essentially establish anarchy. And now these procedures may seem complex, but they're not nearly as complex as the procedures that you have now in the Congress and in other legislative bodies like the parliaments in Europe.
So for our viewers who have not yet read the book, and again, they definitely should read the book. It definitely is. It presents a fascinating idea for how we can create a legislature of the people. What you're saying in essence is that right now we have the Congress, composed, of course, of the House of Representatives and the Senate. But that Congress, in order to have a seat at the table in Congress, people have to run for elections. They have to, and there's all sorts of different obstacles and corruptions that go along with that. What your proposed legislation would do, through its 2 parts, is it would create a separate legislative body that all people, all citizens of the United States are a part of. They don't have to run to be part of this second legislative body. They are registered to vote within it, and any person who is a citizen of the United States and a natural person, as you put it, is able to introduce legislation. And legislation that is ratified and approved by that citizens' legislature would have the same legal bearing as any legislation that is introduced in Congress. It's not a legislative body that would replace Congress. It's one that would exist alongside it. Is that a serviceable summary of what you're proposing?
Excellent summary of it. And one of the things I would just add to it is that when the people become part of a legislature of the people, whether individually, collectively, they become the senior partners.
Yes.
Because they are the sovereigns. When you're elected to the Congress as a representative, you may have a monopoly on lawmaking, but you're not the sovereign.
Right.
And so by being the sovereign, And that's why representative government will become so much more effective, because they will fear their own destruction. If the Congress were to continue to be cantankerous towards the will of the people in the people's legislature, the people's legislature could wipe out the Congress. They have that sovereign power. But once the people establish a legislature of the people, they cannot be wiped out by the Congress.
Mm-hmm.
Immediately the people exercise their sovereignty as lawmakers. They become the senior partners of the government, meaning the Congress, the executive, the president, and the courts. So they become the senior partners. So if any one of those agencies of government institutions go off the rails, then it would be up to the people with their legislative power to correct that in any way they deem necessary. So your description was perfect.
Okay. So in what that means is that if a piece, so with the Congress that we have right now, the House of Representatives and the Senate, that would not be able to abolish the legislature of the people. Would the legislature of the people be able to abolish the Congress?
Yes, of course, because they're the sovereign.
Right.
And you want to make the distinction. The people are sovereign right now. The problem is they have no procedures to exercise that sovereignty. And that's what this legislation does. It sets up the procedures constitutionally and in federal law to operate a legislature of the people. And the minute you have now a vehicle for the people to be able to exercise their sovereign power, that sovereign power is superior to the power of the courts, the executive, and the Congress. Because all three of those institutions are not set up by the sovereign. They're not sovereign unto themselves. But when you now bring the people into a lawmaking capacity, they are the sovereigns, and they now have the power in a very legalistic kind of way to use that power. If the people are sovereign, and if we don't find a way to empower them to use that sovereignty, we'll see another revolution. We'll see violence. And that's ridiculous when we have a civilization today that's based upon law, that we would not be able to implement an evolutionary process based upon the law that we have and we enjoy the benefits of.
So obviously the question becomes, how do we get this proposal, the two-part proposal to create the legislature of the people and to enact the Legislative Procedures Act? How do we get this signed into law? Because obviously the Congress that exists right now would have no interest in sharing its power. The Congress would be absolutely horrified by a prospect that would allow me and my next door neighbor to have, in a sense, even more political power than Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi. So here in your book, you have explained that there is a process of ratification that occurs outside the Congress. Can you describe that process for our viewers?
Yes, the first thing that I think that we have to understand is that that it has to be independent of the Congress, and it has to be legal. And so there has to be a precedent in the creation of our government that we use to define the legality of what we're doing. Now, what we're doing is, once we have a sufficient number of people who indicate that they understand the role of lawmaker that they would have, that we would then create an entity. We'd call it Philadelphia 2, 30 individuals who come forward, and then they raise the money to go forward, and we could do an entire paper ballot where we would hand out ballots and ask people to sign them and thereby vote for the enactment of the Constitution and the Federal Act. Now, this is not a secret ballot. This is an open ballot. You either want to be a lawmaker or you don't. And so once we get a sufficient number of ballots in the affirmative, and that number is very simple. the majority of the people who voted in the last presidential election. That's the only national that we have, national election that we have. So we use that precedent. And then once the majority vote in that regard, or even more than the majority vote in that regard, it becomes the law of the land. And the precedent for that is Article 7 of the Constitution, the article that created our government. Now, let's examine that article so that we can understand how it becomes the precedent for what we are doing. In that article, the framers of the Constitution in Philadelphia decided that they did not trust the people. So when they're ready to get that the ratification of the Constitution, they know that the Confederation, which is the existing government, won't enact it because it'll be destroying its own existence. So the next thing is they know that if the people were to ratify, they wouldn't ratify because of slavery so prominently established in the Constitution. So Madison had to figure out a way how to get it ratified with the people at arm's length and with no involvement by the Confederation. And so what they landed upon is that in the Article 7 is very clear. When the conventions of 9 states ratify this Constitution, it becomes the law of those 9 states.
Yes.
Now, and so so they had 13 states at the time, and so when 9 had ratified, which was essentially done in 1789, then it became the law of those 9 states. Now, there was great opposition to the Constitution because a lot of people felt it was overpowering. A lot of people felt it was not enough, and a lot of people felt that slavery should not be sanctified in the Constitution. Be that as it may, when those 9 states ratified, they essentially, on a voluntary basis, now keep in mind, it wasn't the people. It was the leaders who got elected to these ratification conventions, just like the leaders that went to Philadelphia. They now had the power to vote for or against the ratification. When they voted for the ratification, they made a political decision. Now, this is the conventions, not the people. They made a conscious decision to do away with the Confederation Constitution and adopt this new Constitution for these 9 states. Now, there was a lot of opposition to the Constitution, but after those 9 states had decided to ratify via convention those 9 states, the people in those 9 states, then what had happened was the rest of the states followed along, and the opposition to this new government just dissipated. And the reason why it dissipated is because the leadership opposed, obviously realized that unless this government came into being, the Confederation would dissolve into anarchy. And what scared them the most was the fact that Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts the year before and currently in the year of 1787 was a threat, a violent threat to the leadership of the various states involved. And so now you had a situation that 9 states voted, the conventions of 9 states voted to ratify the Constitution, thereby creating a government for those 9 states, but setting a precedent for other states to come in and adopt the same process. And why it worked is because the people then just opposition evaporated, and the people themselves, not the conventions, but the people accepted the government. Now, that's how we created our government. So let's look at how we would set up the procedures for the people to become lawmakers. Very simply, rather than ask for the conventions of all 50 states, we can do better than that. We have the technology to ask the people directly, do you want to become a lawmaker? And if the people vote in the affirmative in sufficient numbers, then obviously it becomes the law of the country. It doesn't change the existing representative government. What it does is it adds the people to a governing process whereby they become lawmakers with procedures to act in a very deliberative, rational fashion. That's how we create, and that's the precedent. Now, we could look at the precedent of the 9th and 10th Amendments to the Constitution, where it essentially says that if it's not covered in the Constitution, the people still have this power, or the states still have this power. That's of a general nature, which indicates we have the power to do this. But I wanted to stick with the process of how we created the government to how we would enact procedures for the people to be able to make laws. Does that explain it, I hope?
Yes, it does. So what you're saying is that the ratification, it wouldn't go through Congress. It wouldn't be introduced by a congressman or congresswoman and then passed by a majority and then go on to the Senate and to be signed into law by the president. It would be kind of an act of direct democracy where we go to the people and find a majority of the American people vote in the affirmative. Now, you said that the majority would be determined by the number of people who went out to vote in the most recent presidential election. So you would basically need roughly 65 million people to vote in the affirmative for this to create this legislature of the people.
That's correct. And
Yeah.
what would happen as a reality is if the people start voting with these ballots, and you
Mm-hmm.
get 65, 70 million. But if the people want to keep voting, let them vote. Let's
Mm-hmm.
see if we can get 70, 80, 100 million people who would vote for this. The stronger the numbers, the more likely is that the opposition will just cave in. And there's two reasons why they cave in. Because the numbers are asserting themselves, and the more people assert themselves, the more they want this power and would be very angry if somebody tried to thwart their efforts. And two, the people, the Congress would essentially step aside, and the people would then assert themselves totally in this regard. Now, that's the reason why, even before we have the election, we have to go through an educational effort, which is what the book is trying to do, is to educate people to the possibility that you could become a lawmaker. Most Americans don't settle on that. They assume that their representatives, that they give their power away on election day, and that by voting, they are all powerful, which is a joke. With the suppression that we see in voting, when a person has to stand in line for 7, 8 hours to vote, is that really a process of voting that's fair? Obviously not. And so voting is not the beginning or end all of this process. In fact, the elites have deluded us into thinking that voting makes us powerful, and that's the way it is around the world. Oh, the fact that you can vote, though imperfectly, the fact that you could vote makes you a sovereign. No, it doesn't, because the representative governments in question manipulate the voting process, and by and large gives you a very imperfect process to, one, vote for an individual who then makes the law. And of course, there's a further manipulation, because that individual in seeking office will tell you what you want to hear so that he or she can get your vote. And then after they get elected, well, you see what happens. The incompetence, the inefficiency of representative government and legislative bodies. Here, let's just take the House, the Democratic House of Representatives just in the last year. Here, we have received evidence that the military lied to us as to what was going on in Afghanistan. And it's accepted. It's a little bit like the Pentagon Papers. This is the lies that they've been telling you. So now you'd assume that, knowing that the people running the war are lying to us, both the politicians and the military, and you'd think that something would happen. Nothing. The Congress just votes through the funds that you need to wage the war. And so when a politician says, well, well, I'm opposed to the war, well, what did you do to stop the funding? Nothing. We just voted as a group. Now, these are the good people. I'm not talking about the crazies like Mitch McConnell and his terrible Republicans that are trying to destroy democracy. I'm talking about the leadership of the Democratic Party, which is controlling the House, and they do nothing to stop the wars. They turn around and vote for appropriations to expand our nuclear capability, which is the most immoral thing we can do. And so you go through the analysis of the budget and you find out what the hell is going on with the good people in Congress just voting to enact this budget, which is essentially a budget to destroy the planet. And so now, this is what we have in representative government. I deal with it in the first chapter, the failure of representative government. And heck, you could write volumes about it. I just touch upon a couple things that struck me as very serious. One is a nuclear accident that could destroy the planet, or the continued environmental degradation of the planet will destroy the planet in a slow motion fashion.
You're talking about the failure of republicanism, not as in the Republican Party, but in the idea that we have representatives who supposedly vote on our behalf, which is why so many different people are advocating for a system of direct democracy. And you mention in the book that when we have this new legislature of the people established, that voting would be conducted electronically. That would remove the need for people to show up to the polls and vote on election day to stand in these ridiculously long hours you're talking about. I'm not sure how anybody can say we have free and fair elections in the United States after what we witnessed on Super Tuesday and then the subsequent Democratic primaries that were held amidst the coronavirus. You mentioned in the book that this voting would be held electronically. In order to prevent this dysfunction that we see with in-person voting. A lot of people have these concerns about electronic voting being hacked into or manipulated by nefarious powers. How do you respond to those people who say it's even more unreliable and treacherous than the form of voting that we have right now?
First off, what we have right now is so dysfunctional. It's almost, you can make the statement, well, we set it up electronically so it can be hacked. If you don't want it to be hacked, the technology is there or can be developed to guarantee that electronically it'll work. The reason why we insist on having the technology spruced up to guarantee that it'll work is that we turn around right at the beginning. The first act of the Citizens Trust is to register all citizens for life. Now, that changed the whole dynamic. Right now, elections are conducted by the local and state level, and the reason that was put into the Constitution was to protect slavery.
You mentioned that in the book, that the Jim Crow laws that were then reinforced by the Supreme Court, you mentioned that.
That's correct. So what we're doing is the first thing that the Citizens Trust will do right after it's created into existence, the first monies will be to make sure that we register everybody for life. So you're only registered once. When you become 18 years old, you're registered. So you can vote at any time in the future. Now, to provide for that, you have to have an electronic system or an IT system that will permit that to happen and to work out the kinks and make it efficient. So like when you're ready to vote for a legislative procedure, you could be in France on vacation. And during that week-long period on that federal legislation that you're interested in, you could vote from France. You could vote from anywhere in the world, because you would then have the super technology to guarantee that it would be done openly and fairly. And that's, of course, in the legislation, in the Legislative Procedures Act, there's several areas, like how would you conduct a hearing? Because that's the first thing you do after a piece of legislation is qualified. You open up a website And everything that happens in the procedures of that legislation till the time it's voted on is all recorded in the website where people can access at any point in time. So the first question is, how do you handle nationally a hearing process on legislation for the whole nation to participate in? That's a technological problem to solve, and I think it can be solved. And the technicians I've talked with feel similarly. And so after you have people voting, not voting, but people participating in a public hearing, which is what legislation does in Congress. Not all legislation gets a hearing because of the partisanship involved. But keep in mind, there's no partisanship in the legislature of the people. The people just express individually their particular views in a hearing process, and then you have a deliberative process where you bring in people, somewhat like a jury, but much, much more sophisticated than that, where they sit there and can deliberate legislation at the federal level or a hearing group for the state level and local level. And then they would deliberate on this and vote and make changes if necessary, as long as they comport to the goal of the legislation. And then after that, the legislation is transmitted, all the reports, and the trust will do analyses of the economic impact, the social impact, the health impact of this legislation. And it's all there for the people to be able to read on a continuing basis or participate in. And then it's sent to the Congress or the state legislature or the city council. It's sent to them to vote in an advisory capacity. It's not a binding vote, but it gives people the benefit of their elected officials giving them advice on how to vote. So then after you have the election, and then it's 7/24s, and at the end of that week long, the compilation will be done electronically of the votes, and will be announced in the website and to the general public the enactment of this particular law or the defeat of this particular law if the people choose not to vote in the affirmative. So that's the process that goes on, which is much better than the Congress. Now, the Congress process is, you get thousands of legislative proposals put in. People can put in proposals they don't even want to have voted on. They just make them look good politically. And then at a point in time, the head of the legislature, which would be the Speaker of the House in the House and the Majority Leader in the Senate, they determine whether the legislation can be considered. Now, that's pretty partisan. And we see it right now with Mitch McConnell in his holding up all this wonderful legislation that would be very beneficial. And so now what happens in our process, and it took me quite a number of days or months to figure this out, what is the way to have the legislative process move forward without a majority leader or a speaker? The answer is simple: chronologically. So when you put your legislative proposal in and I follow with my legislative proposal, yours will be treated first. Mine will be treated second. And so at the federal level, we can only treat 52 of them. And then if there's more than 52, then you wait in line and start next year. You're still in line in a chronological fashion. That was very, very difficult to figure out. It seems simple now, but it didn't jump on the table at the time.
So if I were to be registered, after we've created the Legislature of the People and passed the Legislative Procedures Act, we now have a system where every single American citizen is able to introduce legislation into this body. So if I introduce my piece of legislation, my bill to, say, decriminalize marijuana in the United States, that bill does not require any co-sponsors before it goes for a formal vote. It's just that because this one person introduced the bill, then automatically it reaches that level of formal national consideration.
After you take well, first off, in the drafting of this, you would call up the legislative trust and say, I've got this legislation. Would you have an attorney look over the constitutionality of it and the propriety of it? So they would have a staff of people, just like we have a staff of people in the Congress that does this for the members. Okay, so we take your legislation, we get it properly drafted, and the next thing that has to happen, and you do this, the trust doesn't do it, you have to commission a poll to determine if at least 40% of the people in the constituency, in the relative constituency, wants to treat the subject. Now, if you don't get 40%, that ends the whole process right there. If you get your 40% or more, then the trust takes in the legislation, opens up a website for it, and then sets up a hearing, a national hearing on the subject. So people can have their input, experts, you name it. And then after the hearing, it's transmitted to a deliberative body that then deliberate it again and bring in experts if they want. And this is a small body, 20, 30 people at most. And they would sit there and they would deliberate your proposal. And then after their deliberations, they would vote one way or the other on it in the body, and then take the hearing record, the deliberative record, and transmit that to the relative government in question. So if it's a national, it'd be the Congress. Then the Congress within 90 days would have to vote up or down publicly on the legislation. And of course, this is not binding. This is an advisory vote. And then after that, the legislation would be scheduled for a vote. And so let's say on April 20th, the week of April 20th, you would have 7 days to be able to vote from anywhere in the world through the electronic technology that we would have in place for you to vote. And if the majority of the people voted for your legislation, it would become the law of the land. That's the process. It's no different. A similar process exists in the Congress. The only thing is that this process is more transparent.
Yes.
Anything and everything that happens with respect to this legislation is recorded on the website so people could see and make a judgment on the information they're receiving. So in an ideal sense, people receive perfect information, literally, on every piece of legislation that is in the process of being considered. It's not at the end of the process, it's on a continuing basis by going to this website, which would then provide all this information for the people to make a decision. And so they can make a decision at the beginning, they can make a decision at the end, and they can finally vote. It's up to the individual citizen. But what we guarantee is that the information available to the individual citizen is as complete as possible. And this, of course, does not happen at all in the Congress, not at all. The average citizen doesn't know, they get a summary off of CNN. That's about all you get. But that's not the way the legislature of the people would function.
So how would a private citizen of limited means like myself be able to conduct a poll whereby I could get 40% of the American people to express their interest in the legislation?
A national poll would probably cost around $40,000. Now, once you have determined via the poll that 40% of the people want to consider this legislation, you don't have to spend a sou. The Electoral Trust does everything. But the fact that you have to have a poll and that you have to pay for it, if there's not at least $40,000 available to do the poll, then the threshold of 40% of the people is illusory, because if you can't get $40,000 to do a national poll, the subject really is not able to draw any interest to speak of. So what you would do, since you're doing it as an individual, you would put out on your Twitter feed, or you'd put out on the email, here's what I want to try to introduce. Anybody want to join me? Anybody want to contribute so that we can finance the poll in this regard? And so an issue like what you're saying, the decriminalization of marijuana, you won't have any problem getting the $40,000 to pay for the poll. But it can't be paid for by the trust. It's got to be done. It's another barrier to make it interesting or make it real that intelligent legislation is being considered, because there'll be all kinds of crazies that will be put forth legislation that won't even be able to get beyond the poll, and that's good, because you don't have to consider every crazy idea that everybody may have. You have to be able to deal with thoughtful issues that affect the lives of the citizens in question.
Okay. So you mentioned earlier that you have to be a natural citizen in order to introduce legislation, but that doesn't mean that I can't solicit funding from multiple people. Like it's okay for the polling. If I wanted to get the $40,000 to run a national poll to show that there's interest in my legislation, it's okay to solicit funds and donations from multiple people. That's not a violation.
From anybody who wants to put up the money to do the poll.
Okay.
There's no limitation on that, because all you're trying to do determine if the people in that constituency want to bother to take the time to go forward with the processing of the legislation. It's not the enactment of the legislation. It's the willingness to spend the time to focus on it. And that is a very legitimate and open-ended question.
And so once it passes that threshold, then the text of the bill that I want to introduce would appear on this website that everybody can access. They can read the text of the bill, and then they have 7 days to vote on it, you said. 24 hours a day.
No, you're jumping ahead.
Oh, okay.
After they have the website open, then now the legislation has to be processed with a hearing, deliberations, research, experts. All of that comes into play. And then at the end of that exercise, it's scheduled for a vote by the trust, because there'll be other people putting in their legislation. And so your legislation will be treated chronologically with other legislation in an election that is 1 week long and can be voted upon by citizens who are anywhere in the world. So it's a process. And you can't short circuit the process. Right. You have to go through the hearings. You have to go through the markups. And this is essentially how the Congress works. They have hearings. They have subcommittee assignments, which are deliberative. And then they have final votes on the floor if the majority leaders let it be voted on. In our particular case, there is no barrier. Once you're qualified by 40% of the people, your legislation is processed all the way to the period of enactment or the vote.
Okay. So with that being said, then once the bill has been vetted, it has been deliberated upon, there have been experts to testify, it then goes on to a website that is accessed publicly. Anybody can go on here, and anyone who is a registered voter and citizen of the United States can log onto that website and vote either yes or no for that legislation.
First off, the website is open to anybody in the world to read it.
Right.
Not just Americans.
Right.
No. How knowledgeable are you with the legislation in the British Parliament? Probably not at all. Well, but this changes the dynamic of having the details of the legislation on a website that's continually developed by the processing of the legislation is a very, very democratic process to stay informed. So if you don't bother to focus on legislation until it's time to vote, you got a whole week to go over the website and read what the hell happened, to make up your own mind how to proceed. So it's a process.
Yes.
And that's what's so critical, because if the people just had the power to make laws, but did not have a deliberative process, it'd be anarchy. You need to and of course, that's what legislative bodies are all about. They have a process to be able to process the legislation to its final conclusion, whether approved or not. The difference is that the process we have is so transparent that it shames the process and lack of transparency that exists in the Congress and in all legislative bodies in the world.
So this would represent the culmination of the civic adolescence that we started talking about at the beginning of this video, because now people are expected to be knowledgeable about this legislation and to take an active role in the process. This is sort of the counter argument to the concerns of anarchy that people would have if we were to talk about making a legislature of the people. They would be afraid that people's pettiness and irrationalities and ignorance would come to the surface in the form of ridiculous, destructive legislation.
Correct. And that's the reason why we have the Legislative Procedures Act in addition to the Constitutional Amendment. To have the Constitutional Amendment without the legislative procedures, you'd create anarchy. And so what we would do is we have these procedures that the people, and the word is, the people will make laws in a deliberative fashion.
Yes.
And that's guaranteed in the legislature of the people. It is not guaranteed in any legislative body in the world. Because here, you want to see how some leaders say, oh, the people act as a mob. No, not under this process. But where the people act as a mob is in a Congress, like what happened with the Patriot Act. Over 300 pages put on people's desks and voted the next day. Obviously, they don't know what they're voting on. It's
right.
on the cliches. The same thing with what's going on in the budget, where the budget is 500, 600, 700, 900 pages long. Do you think a member has read every pass? Of course not. And of course, there's no procedures like we have in the Legislative Procedures Act that will permit the average citizen to go on into any facet of the process and become informed if they so choose. If they don't, like maybe there's an issue coming up that I don't have any interest in, and you do. And so I would contact you and say, how are you going to vote? Well, I'm going to vote this because I've been following this very closely. I'll say, okay, well, I'll follow your vote. But I don't take my time to study it because the process demands consideration. And so that's why we set up all the steps that take you to the voting process. And if you want to be informed, you can be informed. If you don't, you don't do it. You may not even vote. The vote is based upon the turnout. And so if people aren't interested in the subject, they don't vote. But I'll tell you what will happen if they don't vote and they are impacted negatively by the legislation that the people voted on. The next time there's a vote, you can be sure they'll pay attention.
So with that being said, as people take a more active role, or really any role, in the legislative process, you said that the Congress as it exists today will still continue to exist. But it seems to me that if the legislature of the people accomplishes what you hope it will do, that Congress would eventually become so obsolete and so culturally irrelevant that it would just begin to fall apart. I mean, why would anybody bother running for that congressional position, knowing all of the expense that it requires to get in there? Why would they even bother to do so, except as some kind of bizarre vanity project?
Well, keep in mind, it's a logical result, and your analysis is probably correct. I don't know. I do know, and I'm knowledgeable enough to say that I don't understand all of the consequences of a legislature of the people. I view it as beneficial. May not be. I don't know. But and so purposefully in this legislation that we're putting forward, we do not make a judgment as to what the people will do. We're giving the people the tools to make laws. How they'll use these tools, I don't know. I think it will be beneficial. I think it will be proper, but I don't guarantee that. I don't guarantee that at all. All I say is you, as a sovereign, have the right to make laws because law is the central portion of governance, human governance. And so if you want to govern yourselves, you have to step away from the unilateral process of representative government where representatives have a monopoly on lawmaking, which empowers a small group of elites to control the government, our society, and our culture. And this, so it means if you look at the analysis of our existing system, we are ruled by a small minority. What I'm suggesting is that by creating a legislature of the people, we will be ruled by the majority of the people in the world and in the United States. So that's the process that's involved in this regard. And I think it's the most compelling one. If people say, well, I don't know if I can trust the people. Well, you're trusting the elites, the billionaires, the zillionaires who are running your society. Now, all I'm suggesting is you should be able to trust yourself. If you can't trust yourself, there's nothing I can say. You're going to get the government you deserve. That's about the size of it.
And one question I had that actually was not related to the text of the legislation that you're proposing. You mentioned in your analysis of American military spending that it's a little illogical for our government to develop more than one nuclear warhead, since one is sufficient to wipe out human life everywhere on the planet, yet somehow our government finds it necessary to, what did you say, was it 6,500 nuclear?
Yes, 500. That's an agreement between Russia and ourselves where they have 6,500, we have about 6,500. And any of the 9 nations involved could let loose, I don't think one bomb would do it, but let loose 10, 20 to 100 bombs, you just create a nuclear winter, and that's the end of the planet. So how ridiculous it is that we're spending, under Obama, the Congress authorized $1.7 trillion to refurbish our nuclear arsenal. Now, if you look at the record of the Pentagon, then you're talking about cost overruns. So what the Congress is doing is spending over a 30-year period somewhere around $3 to $5 trillion to refurbish our nuclear capability, when at the end of the exercise, the nuclear capability is irrelevant, because if anybody used it, we're committing planetary suicide. So does this make it? This is what representative government has taken us to. It's insanity what they're doing. And if you listen to the military that are telling us in speeches that, hey, it's okay to have first strike capabilities because we want to induce fear into the people that might attack us. First off, there's nobody threatening the United States. Threatening the United States is suicidal. And I don't know of any of the major leaders. They may be crazy in other areas, but they're not suicidal. Kim Jong-un is not suicidal, and nor is Putin, and nor is Xi. Now, to really determine the relationship between China and the United States, the contest there, here, China has about 250 nukes. We have 6,500. Who do you think is the most aggressive party between the two of them in trying to impress the other with possible destruction? China? Obviously the United States. And we do this worldwide. When's the last time China invaded any other country? Look at the United States. We invade Iraq, we invade Libya, we invade Syria. It goes on and on. China hasn't done anything like that. And so for the people to understand that China is a threat, here, let's look at the main arguments in the United States, and that is what China is doing in the South China Sea. And that requires us to parade our nuclear flotillas, our nuclear aircraft carriers up and down the China Sea to guarantee the freedom of passage. Freedom of passage, it's vital to China. It's vital to Korea, South Korea. It's vital to Japan. And so China is going to destroy themselves by impeding the passage of the South China Sea? Of course not. And so that's the threat that we're saying that China. So we go on the other side of the world into the South China Sea with our nuclear carriers and parade up and down saying that we're bringing freedom of the seas. Well, China wants freedom of the seas. That's their economic livelihood. And the reason why they've dredged up these islands, keep in mind, China has only 2 nuclear carriers, new aircraft carriers. We have 11. So by dredging up these islands, what they've done is they've essentially established 12 nuclear carriers that are not movable and not sinkable. There's islands, have nothing but runways and a few buildings that they could use, like we would use our flotillas in this regard. And so to accuse China with doing something wrong in the South China Sea is ridiculous. China wants to have influence in their geographic domains. Nothing wrong with that. We have influence in the Western Hemisphere, where we state the Monroe Doctrine, that no foreigner can come close to doing anything in the Western Hemisphere without our permission. And so that China wants to have influence in its geographic domain, we find resentful to that. One of the problems that Americans have is a psychic problem. And because subconsciously they know something that is not discussed openly, by and large. And that is the fact that China has brought about more freedom of the individual than any other country in human history. Whoa, that's a big statement. How could you make it? Well, it's true. What China has done in the last 30 years is to take 600 million Chinese and move them from poverty to middle class. Now, when you're poor, you're oppressed. Forget the kind of government you got. You're poor and you're oppressed in the most terrible fashion. When you move to middle class, you now have the ability to educate your children, feed your families, have decent employment. Now, you may not be able to vote for who's in charge, but then again, look at the United States. We voted and look what we got as president. Here, the tragedy is that in this pandemic, which is probably the worst since the Middle Ages, that we have the unfortunate situation of having a narcissistic fool as the head of the most powerful nation on earth. And so we question China and the fact that they have an autocratic country, but they created more freedom than we ever thought of creating. And I think that disturbs Americans because it calls into question the nature of our present governance. And it's a very thoughtful and commanding concept of this accomplishment, because middle class, when you got money, you got freedom. You may not be able to vote for the leader, or if you try to vote for the leader and you got to wait 6 hours in line, or you can't vote because there's not enough polls. That's the American way. The Chinese way is, well, the Communist Party makes those decisions. So either way, they're open to criticism. But here's the thing that is really what happened. 600 million people have been moved from poverty to middle class. Wow, what an accomplishment that is.
It's funny where we see our priorities for spending money. I always thought when I was reading your book that the most offensive concept you introduced here for the Congress would not be the idea that they would have to share their power, but the stipulation that the legislature of the people has to receive the same amount of funding as the United States Congress.
Let me jump on that, because that was a difficult question. It looks simple, but it was very difficult. And through the iterations over the last 20 years, we had every kind of way of appropriating the money. And it wasn't until a year ago that I finally came to the conclusion, I've got to figure out a simpler and a more direct way to fund this. And it's very simple. Representative government has the Congress, and the Congress appropriates the money. The Congress appropriates the money to pay for the cost of their operation. Well, what we're doing is not waiting on the Congress, which we had in several iterations, to appropriate the money because they wouldn't do it. We're saying in a constitutional amendment, mind you, that the money is appropriated, and then you got to figure out, well, how much should be appropriated? I don't know. And who can do, we don't have the wherewithal to do the estimates with the legislature. So it's very simple. Since that's the way representative government legislates, let's appropriate the same amount of money that we give to Congress for their operation, for the operation of the people in the legislature of the people. And the money would be first used to turn around and pay for the cost of registering people for life. And then the rest of it would be to set up the staff that would help us draft legislation, that will help the staff to do the hearings. All of these processes take funding. And so we just estimate that the same amount as the Congress. If later on we decide to appropriate more money, we can with the legislature of people. But keep in mind that now the trust will be conducting every single legislation, the voting of every single legislation at the federal level, state level, and local level. Now, this will be working so efficiently that eventually people will say, well, hell, why not do this with all of the offices, elective offices in representative government? Of course, it would be a logical sequence that if you have, now I picked up this idea in Korea, South Korea, they have one central body that conducts all elections. Now that is efficient. What we have in the United States is elections conducted by state and local level, and these are unbelievably complex, different in every locale. The federal government tries to impose some semblance of order, but it's not. Now keep in mind the history of this process of voting in the United States was put in place to protect slavery, and we're living with the consequences of that ever since.
The book is The Failure of Representative Government and the Solution by former Senator Mike Gravel. You can order this book at mikegravel.com. And I wanted to thank you for joining me today, Mr. Gravel. It's always good to hear from you.
Thank you for having me.